Our three panelists this evening, thank you for joining us, are all quite familiar with Monika's work. From the left here, my left, Heidi Zuckerman is the CEO and director of the Aspen Art Museum. Heidi presented a solo show of Monika's work at the museum last year and published a beautiful monograph on the work, the most comprehensive exploration of Monika's practice in print to date. Nicholas Baume, in the middle, is the director and chief curator of the Public Art Fund. In 2012, he presented on Doris Friedman Plaza, which is at the southeast corner of Central Park, an amazing work of Monika's entitled Fir Tree, which is a 40-foot tall staircase made of twisted black steel with a bright red handrail weaving its way around the central mass. And then at the end here is Paola Morsiani, the director of the Neuberger Museum of Art. Before her time at the Neuberger, Paola was the curator of contemporary art at the Cleveland Art Museum, where she brought into the collection a beautiful sculpture of Monika's entitled Stair, completed in 2010. So a big thank you to our esteemed speakers for participating, and the format for this evening will be a conversation among the panelists, and they will also open it up to questions which may then sort of direct the conversation further. But I'd like to begin by asking our panelists how each of you came to know Monika's work.
We'll go in order.
Start?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for inviting us, Christopher. And as Nicholas said, we're in front of an amazing backdrop, so hopefully you can concentrate on us and not totally be distracted by the amazing work behind us. So I first saw Monika's work when she did a project at Manifesta. And I can't even really remember where it was. It was somewhere in Germany. And I found myself in a sort of post-Soviet building looking at art and opened a door that I thought was a door to another gallery. And it turned out to be a door to another room, which looked like a standard room, but it looked initially to me like it was absent of art. I didn't realize at first that it was Monika's art. And then I opened another door which had a similar room and another door, etc. And so I wound my way through this sculptural installation in a way that I hope happens for everyone with art, which was completely unexpected and then really facilitated a sense of wonder, the unexpected and the surprise. And it stayed with me for quite a while. I hadn't been familiar with her work and then was able to encounter it several times after that. But that first impression was really the way one hopes they would find art for the first time.
Yeah, I first saw her work, I think, in the Venice Biennale, and 2003.
In the pavilion?
I think. No, in the
Arsenale,
okay. Where she had a work that I think sort of comes from the body of work you're talking about, of the kind of series of doors leading into space, though this was a kind of telescoping corridor. So it was playing with perspective, as well as this sort of interesting psychological space that Monika creates. So you couldn't see, if you just looked at the corridor, that it was actually diminishing in size. But once you went into the space, you then started to feel, the ceiling sloping down, the walls coming together, and you realize, of course, that she was playing with this sort of sense of a receding space that then was actually kind of trapping you and enclosing you, and something about this kind of, room after room that is an architecture turned into a psychological kind of space, something loaded with that kind of strangeness. So it was a very striking piece. I didn't know of her work before, and was really struck with it from that moment. And of course, she did her amazing Venice Pavilion years later, but that was sort of my first moment.
I saw Corridor, which I felt made you feel like a giant, made you really feel your body. But I would say that I noticed her work later. like, I saw the installation she did at MoMA. She had a project room there, which was disarmingly fake. And then I felt the same kind of jolt as to dealing with a very real structure. For me, it was like very realistic, very much in your face, and very much about your body and how you relate to it. When she did one-on-one in the Polish Pavilion at the Venice Biennale again. And I really was dreaming to bring that to Cleveland, but it never happened. Like a lot of curatorial projects, they don't happen. Yeah, and then so more and more of her work, of course. Yeah.
One of the things that strikes me, and should probably be acknowledged, is how fortunate we are that we're talking about having seen the work in Germany and having seen it multiple times in Venice, and variety of different opportunities. And I think the three of us were all fortunate to be able to bring the work to the U.S. because the work really wasn't seen here before. And maybe we could talk a little bit about that idea of seeing work which comes out of having lived in a communist country, in a country with a different history, a history of fascism, for example, as opposed to seeing it here in the US, and how it sort of translates. And that was one of the things that we tried to address in the Aspen exhibition, because the work that we had was based on a Bauhaus facade. And so, we were starting from a point of not having people be familiar with post-Soviet architecture, or even necessarily the Bauhaus, and that whole history, I think, of the sources that she uses is so important.
Yeah. Go ahead. It's very interesting how when you make that transition, what happens to the work. I have to say that in my case, I bought a piece that actually, the one piece in which she actually refers to American architecture, which is the fire escape staircases, you say? Staircases? Which, if you are European, it's the first thing you notice when you come to the United States. You just are completely mesmerized by the fact that they're out there and you can see them. So they're visible structures. But I bought them for Cleveland, and for me, what remained clear was that, the source of the work was actually where she grew up. And for me, to buy it in Cleveland, where there is a very large Polish community, and also where communist, workers and capitalism were born at the same time, was in fact very significant. But in the end, for me, what worked was the fact that I was working with a certain kind of collection that was very figurative and very naturalistic looking. So, for example, I installed a piece in the same room as the giant toothpaste tube by Oldenburg. And I wanted to insert in the collection a kind of work that would actually question mimetism and question realism, because Monika starts by actually replicating the actual functional piece with the same crew that actually have originally made them. Like in San Antonio, she worked with the crews that make those kind of works. And then, but then she begins this other second phase of making the positive, negative, of creating a formless shape. And so that difference between form and formless, and that sort of very clear, stark naturalism to the shape of the staircase, or how do you call it?
Fire escape.
Fire escape.
Yeah.
Sort of was being eliminated under your eyes, so you had to really work through that. For me, the piece in the collection worked to question these assumptions, which, I mean, it has to do also with this political relationship in And yeah, and I have more, but go.
Also I think, just to put it out there, where I think, we have lots to say about Monika's work and love it and have worked with her and want to share that experience, but I think we also very much want this to sort of be a dialogue with the audience. So, we certainly there'll be time for questions, or in fact, if you have questions as we're talking, or something to add, please, don't feel like we have to be super formal about this. We're all old friends, so we can talk like over the top of each other and interrupt each other, and you should feel the same. This sort of question of locality, I guess, is a key thing for Monika. I've never been to Poland. I know Heidi has, and I think when Monika has talked about her work and its origins, this interesting collision of history, Warsaw, this sort of wonderfully historic city which has been through, so many inventions and reinventions and destructions, including a kind of modernist influenced period of Soviet influenced design, a very particular kind of brand of modernism, and so sort of Monika talks about growing up in that context, and actually not having that much interest in it originally. And she studied as a painter, and went to Amsterdam and studied there. And she sort of talked about the fact that it was really only when she went to another country and sort of was outside of Poland that she suddenly started to kind of see how it had kind of seeped into her consciousness, and that for her as an artist, what was important was to actually mine that experience. And to mine it in a way that was also not to do with necessarily the biggest gestures or the grandest moments of architecture, but the quite everyday experiences of sort of living in a city and walking up a staircase, or turning a doorknob, or seeing, a factory building, or a housing structure, and really just experiencing those sort of quite mundane, unremarkable things, and then seeing that as a starting point for her own sort of aesthetic transformation. And so I think the challenge for her, in a way, which has been very interesting to see, is how to take that very specific response to a place, and then work in other places. Work at Hauser and Wirth in New York City, or in Central Park, or in Aspen or Cleveland, and how to, sort of think about her own practice as very much a sort of a global enterprise, but that is also anchored in these specific relationships. And I think it's been interesting. I've enjoyed sort of watching her think and wrestle with how to sort of bring other locations into her work. And I think, this piece is a great example of that, and we can sort of unpick that a little too.
Yeah, I was thinking about the contradictions in Monika's work, because Monika is sort of classically reticent to talk about a lot of aspects of the work, but then it becomes apparent as you sort of unpack her thinking about it. And so you made really great points about her coming at it from a place of sort of the unexpected or the unintentional. And I think that comes up in the fact that the work appears to be, on many levels, very formal, very much like monumental sculpture, and it is. And she's incredibly precise with how it's made and who she works with, and then the deeper you go, you find out that there's actually a real political element to the work, and there's also a feminist element to the work as well. And I think part of that feminism is part of the politics, and that I think is so inherently Polish, and making this point that women can actually build these very large things, that women have a different perspective, potentially having come out of her background to create something which is both monumental and anti-monumental. Really being able to take something which was utopian and really literally crush it. And make it her own. And I think the sort of power of that gesture in its physicality is so political and so feminist. And yet it appears to have as its precedent, Tony Smith. And so, she plays with those inherent contradictions, and I think that's part of the interesting strength of the work as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I agree completely. I think of Bruce Nauman and pay attention.
Right.
The how he requests that you pay attention, and I relate her scale, her play with scale, her addressing real scale, actual scale, with this pay attention. She really forces you to put your body in connection with this piece. When you walk by this piece, it's like walking by a dead body, but like a whale-like body, but also dead serious. Like I find that it is very, as I said before, real. You cannot not relate to it, and it is a structure that, however, because it is sort of now inside and it is crumpled and it is remade, you have to pay attention to. And that shift for me is political and very important, very interesting. And in part, what I feel is her contribution when she makes these pieces, which are formal, but they are so inherently, there is a symbolism, there is a...
Can I step in for 1 second and
Yeah,
just
yeah,
say,
yeah.
because I came to look at the piece yesterday, and I was thinking about the realness also, and what I was looking at were the handles, and so, like, she doesn't cheat, I mean, it's not formalism, right? It is real. It has, like, all the bolts, it has the handles, and I think that's, like, a big part of its power, is it is actually what you think it is, and then it's also so much more.
Yeah, one of the things to pick up on things you both talked about is what we experience in seeing her work, and to what extent, the fact that she's Polish, which we've talked about a little bit, the fact that she's a woman, how do those elements play into it, and also what is she really inviting us to experience? Because I think her most powerful work, which I would include this piece, are sort of ungraspable in one look. There is no sort of vantage point to see the work that sort of is the best place, or there's no way to sort of grasp actually the whole piece from one location, and so I think there's something interesting about her play with scale and her interest in scale, because just as in those early works, I mean, they somehow were about a sense of alienation, and one can, of course, relate that to the space of her upbringing and origins and a state that felt repressive, but probably also very free in other ways. But there's an interesting sense in which this piece, refuses to be owned and sort of absorbed, just the way One to One, the great piece she did in the Venice Biennale in the Polish Pavilion, you couldn't grasp the whole thing because you were sort of swallowed by it, literally, just as it was swallowed by the room that it was in. If you haven't seen the image of that piece, a kind of structure that was the framework of the steel framework of the building that was somehow squeezed into the Polish Pavilion in Venice. And this bizarre kind of relationship of a one-to-one space that was then sort of crumpled to fit in together. So there's something, this is sort of a little bit maybe the resistance of her work as well, that you see this piece and it is so different from either end or from either side or from the way we experience and move around it.
Yeah, it's both simultaneously completely familiar. It is what it says it is, right? It's a tower. But then as you get close to it, you notice the things like the dichotomies of how it's made, and then the fact that it's overpainted. Because one of the pieces that we had in Aspen was it seemed to be a sort of a perfect continuum, right? And but you knew that obviously it had to have come together at some point because it couldn't have been cast. It was a bent I-beam, and so it was bent and then kind of attached back to itself. But I mean, hours of looking. People spent hours looking, trying to find that moment of the seam. And so she plays with that idea of self-knowledge and expectation, both physically in terms of what we expect from the work and how we know our bodies in space, and that size and scale, and then also the sort of social emotional hope that we want to kind of believe in magic, right? And I think the work really embraces that. It's like, how did that get in here? How did she do that? And that sense of wonder that I mentioned upon seeing her work the first time, I think she's really been able to retain in the viewer, because there is that idea of, well, maybe it is possible. Maybe it's possible to do the impossible. But then she also embraces the inherent failure, right? No, the impossible is not possible. It's inherently flawed.
Yeah.
So she vacillates back and forth between those two different paradigms, big and small, Polish and international, hopefulness and inherent failure.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, I think for me it also has to do with the fact that she was born after the modernist structures had done their job. She was born when they were a ruin. So she always often talks about how people, about older generation talking about how it used to be like living in those structures, because in a way she was born at the very end of that. So there is somewhat of an imagined past that she hears from people, and then there is the reality of the ruin right there, and how things didn't work. That it's just the reality that she was born to.
So you know what, actually, something that might be interesting to share is a little bit about how sort of some of the ideas that ended up being realized in this piece emerged, because when, having sort of discovered Monika's work, 10 plus years ago and seen her develop, very soon after I started as director and chief curator of Public Art Fund here in New York, thought Monika would be a superb artist to give the challenge of doing a piece in New York. And so that discussion, started several years ago. And it was a challenge for Monika because I think she really, of course, wanted to think about how to make something that sort of brought all of her kind of signature interests, if you like, or sort of core interests, but also made it relevant to New York City. And she, because of this interest in modernism and the kind of variants of modernism that had happened around the world, Mies van der Rohe was a key figure for her. And of course, the Seagram building here in New York is sort of one of the most iconic skyscrapers in the world, and so something she was fascinated with. And I guess, Mies himself was a figure who brings this kind of, European American dialogue into a very tangible kind of achievement. So she was fascinated with that structure. We got her into the library at MoMA, which of course has incredible Mies archives, and so she just started exploring Mies' work with the initial idea of really focusing on the Seagram building, but then actually kind of getting interested in other Mies structures, the Lakeshore Drive apartments in Chicago, and sort of, discovering and poring over architectural plans. And so, it's interesting to think also that the way she works is very anchored in history and a research and an exploration of quite specific buildings, places, locations, people. She got completely sort of obsessed with that idea and sort of developed the work. Mind you, we had sort of several other conversations about completely different bodies of work. She was also really interested in the kind of Soviet statuary that is all over Poland, and that maybe finds some sort of cousins in some of the statuary around New York City as well, even in a location like Rockefeller Center, heroic, muscular kind of sculptures celebrating labor and the power of the worker. That was sort of something she got very interested in. Anyway, the whole sort of Mies project was kind of a bigger thing that needed more time. So the piece we ended up doing, as Christopher mentioned, was a piece called Fir Tree that was kind of based on a spiral staircase, which is very beautiful, and of course as a tree form kind of related much more to Central Park as a location. But of course the piece that we're here with tonight is that Mies building sort of ripped apart and rolled on itself and sort of twisted in a way in sort of two parts, like this sort of extraordinary kind of cocoon. Because one of the things that's interesting to me as well is the way her work, on the one hand, it has this sort of formal elegance to it. Everything she does is just an exquisite sculpture in the most sort of classical sense. But at the same time, she's using industrial processes. She's using industrial machinery. She's using the fabricators who make buildings to do this kind of work. She's not. That sort of question of her subjectivity in the creation of the piece is sort of complicated by the way she chooses to actually fabricate it, which of course is the only way you could fabricate it. I mean, you know, she's not that muscly. I mean, if you've met Monika, but and then also the way something like this that's a huge metal abstract, or like becomes this sort of abstract form that has a basis in reality, then also opens up to all kinds of other, you know, formal analogies, and you know, people have found all kinds of different forms in this piece. You know, the whale, or sort of a cocoon I just mentioned, or you know, the piece we did in Central Park was like a tree. But these are all forms that somehow, you know, turn from one thing into the other while remaining kind of what they are. And it's, to come back to that point you made, Heidi, I think it is this way that she holds sort of two, even sometimes contradictory things in motion at the same time, that's incredibly sort of powerful and captivating.
So, to talk a little bit about your piece, because it was installed right before the hurricane here, Hurricane Sandy, and I remember Christopher and I walked down to see it, and we sat next to it for a while the day after the hurricane, when people were pilgrims, right, trying to go from place to place without cell phones and power, and there were all these people that actually stopped and thought that the shape was because of the hurricane. And
that's true.
So, you know, this unintentional additional context was pretty great, because art is what we see it to be, right?
Yeah.
There's the artist's intention, and then there's the viewer's reception. And to take a piece out in the public and to have it have a contorted space, you know, of course that could never have happened with the winds and, you know, whatnot, but, you know, people thought that it might have, and so, I don't know, I just thought I would mention that.
Yeah, and I mean, there is, right, I mean, in a way that's also about the violence.
Right.
Like, there is
Right.
violence in the work. Like, it's beautiful, but it's violent. And, I mean, that's really, I think, sort of interesting.
Yeah. Yes. I also, in preparation for this, I was trying to think a lot of things about, and I find that contemporary sculptors are always playing with this paradigms of realism and metaphor. And so I picked up the book by Venturi, Learning from Las Vegas, and it speaks a lot also about Mies van der Rohe and how Mies van der Rohe had, and modernism, had substituted symbolism with space. So eliminated symbolism attached to architecture just by reducing architecture to pure lines in space. And I came to realize how she takes away space in her version. She's taken away space and she has put it on the floor, which is low and visceral. And so the violence is very subtle. She uses a lot of references, a lot of forms of violence, or a lot of forms of emotions that have to do with violence. It is not necessarily in your face. But in your essay on her work, you spoke about how monuments have fallen quite a bit recently, or in history. That's very interesting. It's been the destiny of monuments to be taken down, and so that's a very interesting. It was good to read.
Can you take the question?
Yes.
New Yorker, it's hard not to think of 9/11 when you see this work, and I think this is even a stronger reference than Mies van der Rohe. Of course, you think of Mies van der Rohe, but like this crumpled skin, I think very much refers to. I mean that maybe Europeans would think about modernism or about the Second World War or something, but I think the reception is very different in different countries, and maybe that's a much place.
Yeah, you can't have a fallen tower in New York without some kind of 9/11 reference. I mean, whether it's intentional or unintentional. So particularly now with the opening of the new tower, and it's just there. So, no question.
Yes.
I'm French, so I can tell you how I can receive it. When I came in, I was very surprised by the space and by that huge thing here. It was like a kind of plane which has burned, or a kind of a part of a wing of an angel who has failed, that you kept like it's from very, very far away. So it's very strange. And what was very interesting too, the fact was that man were there, like a scale, you know, and he was moving, walking, and he was so small on the wall, and it was creating a kind of tension, and that was very, very interesting. To see all that cool things, huge, alone, one man, like this in front of, and that was fun.
I had the same impression yesterday, actually.
Yes.
So, because when I came in, you were standing right in front of it, and so then you got this backdrop. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think actually one of the things you said resonates for me in the sense that what this looks like, I mean, if you think of it's a lovely idea of the angel's wing that's somehow crashed. I mean, I guess angels must be very big, you know, up in
We're really small
heaven.
cuties.
But I mean, it's sort of an organic form in a way, like a wing. Just like a whale is an organic form, just like a tree is an organic form. But all of these have their origin in architecture, you know, in metal and angles and rectilinear structures. And so the way she you know, transforms or kind of opens the work to all kinds of different readings and interpretations. But particularly that transformation, I mean, if you think of like describing what she does and then the effect it has, you know, they're so far apart. It's kind of amazing that she achieves sort of what she does.
Question about the logistics of being a curator, and if you learned anything or came to appreciate anything new in having to install her work.
Well, that's a good one. I can actually take that one. I'm sure you guys have things to add too. One of the works that we had in Aspen was actually suspended from the ceiling, and it was a facade of windows that was bent sort of into a triangle, and it needed to appear weightless, but of course it was incredibly heavy, and it dangled sort of just above the floor, enough so that like school children could go right underneath it and kind of lay looking at it, and you're, you know, no, it was fine, but you know, that was it was a real challenge for our preparators, and Monika was very specific in terms of how high off the ground it should be, and when she is making works for a space specifically, she creates a scale model of the space and scale models of all the objects, and so, you know, their precise placement, both on the floor, but also in relationship to the walls and the ceiling and whatnot, is really important. So what we ended up doing was taking apart some of the ceiling and adding a structure that had to be reinforced along the I-beams, and, you know, covered everything back up, and of course it was seamless. So it really did look magical, and maybe that's part of what I was talking about earlier about the hopefulness of the work, the hopefulness that it might actually have some kind of magical quality to it. So,
and also depending on the space, like in Cleveland, you had to walk kind of several feet before arriving in the Gallery of Contemporary Art, and you saw the piece on the wall, and it looked at first like a drawing, you know. But it's very interesting when you especially buy for a collection, sort of you are, you know, determined this is a piece, and then eventually it arrives at the museum, you're like, what? Oh my gosh, they allowed me to buy this gigantic thing, and you know, storage and all of that, and you know, and installing it. Oh my gosh, it becomes. But it's wonderful because everyone makes it happen. You know, the museum it's all together with you. Everyone is helping to make it happen. You know, it's amazing how contemporary art, when it's not installed, looks very strange, like nothing. And then, you know, it has to really, it's very fragile. At the Cleveland Museum of Art, I always had this conversation that, you know, classical art, Greek art, is not fragile. It's contemporary art that is fragile. Contemporary art needs a lot of attention and a lot of care by the conservator, who need to learn everything about it. If a piece from 5,000 years ago has made it up to here, we don't need to pay attention to that.
You see, Paola, now you know how difficult it is to do public art.
You're right.
You know, it's out there. You can't like stop people from, you know, touching it and doing everything you're not supposed to do in museums.
Actually, it's very interesting that I'm sorry. I wanted to ask you a question about being outside. You know,
Hurricanes.
Yes, but and also, I mean, as a curator, I've been thinking a lot, and it is, you know, working in a museum, I've been thinking a lot how much art now happens outside of museums, and how these pieces by Monika actually really challenge inside. Outside is a very important aspect of her work, and how when they are inside, the meaning really is exacerbated and really becomes very clear. But when they are outside, it's so much more complicated. How do you do it?
Well, and also, I think with Monika's work, she's so sensitive to the site that she works in, and obviously this piece is in dialogue with this space, which is in some ways, I imagine, sort of terrifying to artists. You know, how do you sort of actually take over a space that's on this scale, and that has sort of all the character that it does, you know, with this beautiful ceiling and the timber and the beams, and so for as much as it is terrifying, I think, you know, Monika's a perfect example of the sort of artist for whom this is kind of her natural habitat, and because she works with architecture in a one-to-one scale, you know, I think that the sort of critique is sometimes made that, you know, as museums and galleries get bigger, artists just like make their work bigger and bigger, and it doesn't necessarily mean the ideas are any bigger. But I think, you know, Monika's work is very much about engaging with scale. We've talked about, like, from whether it's the sort of very small scale and that feeling of being sort of squeezed to the feeling of sort of being unable to grasp something because it's so sort of massive and complex and detailed, and playing with our perceptions in those ways. That, you know, the context of this space is you know, I think a rich one for her work, and it's been very interesting to see a relatively new gallery space treated so differently by by different artists in the sort of space of the last, few exhibitions here. But to kind of answer your question there, it is a very interesting shift where, of course, the classical idea of a gallery space is to be neutral, to reduce as much as possible the anything that would sort of distract or take away from or dominate our ability to sort of perceive a work of art in a kind of very clean, neutral setting. Hence, the white cube. One can also discuss that actually is already a very, loaded, context-rich location. But when you do work outside anywhere, but like if you think of New York City, it's sort of the polar opposite, because there's nowhere in the city that isn't just densely layered with multiple uses, with all kinds of transitions happening all through the day, with all kinds of different users and visitors and populations kind of coming through it, with different buildings, different patterns of sort of use and weather, and just so much context. And to create a work that somehow can stand up to all that is an incredibly tough discipline. But like doing a show at Hauser and Wirth, it's really worth it, if you can pull it off. Any other questions? I have a whole list of questions myself, because as I was telling my fellow panelists, I sort of when actually we had a wonderful evening with Monika when the show opened, and I was teasing her about, because leaving the country and leaving us to have to talk about her work, and she said, "Oh well, you can email me and I'll tell you what to say." I'm like, "Okay, perfect." So I suddenly remembered last night that she had made that very kind invitation. So I thought, "Oh good, I'll send her a few questions." And so I typed out my little email, things I'd like Monika to answer, and I didn't get a response. I have the questions, but I do not have the response. But it was only last night, so I can't blame her for that.
Yeah. So I was thinking about what you said in terms of the fragility of contemporary art. Yes. And I think that there's the physical fragility, but I think there's also the contextual fragility. And maybe that's what you're referencing as well. But I think that the spaces in which contemporary art is presented are really important. I think the dialogue around contemporary art is really important. I think how we respect the artist's intention and then also make it available to the audience is really important. Mm-hmm. And in a way, this is the ideal circumstance, right? Because she has the space to herself. And I was, as you were speaking, Paola, just remembering the Felix Gonzalez Torres show, which was at the Byler. And the show was installed actually in and amongst the collection. And it was really tough for the work, I think. I'm a huge fan of Felix's work. But somehow, when you see art that's made out of the everyday, the materials that we're familiar with that are mundane and not sacred, when they're juxtaposed sometimes with these historical objects that take a more traditional art form, it's really challenging. So I think that that's something as curators and exhibition makers that we have to be cognizant of, as well.
Yes, yes. And you have to convince everyone around you in your institution to do it exactly like the artist says. Mm-hmm. And it's, as a curator, that kind of skill.
Advocating for the artists. All right, ask us one or two of your questions and then.
Oh, okay, my questions.
Yeah.
Well, let's see. I do actually,
Pick the
I
best
wasn't
one.
making this up. They're right here.
Pick the hardest one. We'll give it to Paola.
Well,
We
which is the
cannot
hardest
answer.
one. One question I was going to ask her is what's different about this piece compared to other works you've made? Or in a way getting at, like, what surprised her about this piece as well? Because I think, I mean, you touched on a little bit, but one thing that is interesting is the way Monika develops her sculptures. Because while on the one hand there is this sort of element of distancing of her own sort of hand by delegating the process, you know, using this heavy machinery and so forth. What is actually shocking is that every one of her pieces looks like a Monika Sosnowska, right? Like, so on the one hand you have this process that somehow delegates subjectivity, but a result that affirms it, which is, you know, a sort of fascinating thing. And I think part of it is the way she develops her models. You know, she will make very detailed paper models, you know, cut out to you know, very precisely develop the form that she's going to create in manipulating, you know, one of these appropriated structures. And I know she talked about the fact that, I mean, she arrived at this form because in sort of trying to make a vertical tower, she would get to a certain point and it would keep collapsing. Of course, I thought, well, Monika, you just need to stop making it out of paper. But she actually, you know, it sort of became this horizontal form that then she was really fascinated with and decided to sort of pursue that. But it's really interesting to see how precisely she conceptualizes the work on a small scale kind of before it's actually executed.
Yeah, and it's interesting because she spends so much time in that preparatory process and then the process of making it, and both are well documented, and she never wanted that revealed. And we actually struggled with her for our catalog and did ultimately convince her to allow us to print also contextual photographs. So as she walks around, she's always taking pictures of things. And she was so clear that that's not art. The scale models are not art. The production stills are not art. You know, but it's fascinating. As you were saying, you know, she doesn't have a hand in it, but then she does because she actually paints them, and you know, she works with craftsmen, craftspeople that she trusts, that she knows can actually manhandle the material, but yet she's there telling them what to do, you know, so she knows they can do it, but then she's like, you know, squeeze it here, or, you know, roll it there. So, you know, again, I think that's really one of the powers of the work is, you know, that it's both and instead of,
so why
you know,
do
either
you
or.
think she came around to revealing that?
Persistent.
You and Christopher ganged up on it. I can see what happened.
Yeah, but I've also asked myself why Monika is continuously going back to this, because you know, I mean, there is, it's a repertory that somehow shifts but repeats itself. But for me, it goes back to what Heidi was saying, that her work is political, and she hasn't finished peeling the onion of modernism. She's very rigorous that way, and that's what she's doing. She's addressing modernism, she's addressing where she lives, she's addressing how modernism has shaped Warsaw and the life of people and of her people. And there is a very human very humanistic goal that she has. And so each one of these forms that are Monika Sosnowska's, they're all about her quest of understanding what was that it was and where it is now. Eventually it will be done, but she had to deal with Miss van der Rohe.
Well, I think you're really right, and would take it even one step further, which is that it's the larger body of modernism, but then it's also all of its fragments.
Yes.
Right? And so as we were putting together the book, it was very clear that she worked in these sort of 7 different areas. And they were as large as, a full-scale building, which we've referenced before, and as small as a door handle. And so, and each one has its precision and its role to play in her complex understanding.
Yes, yes.
Heidi, you mentioned the both and the inherent contradictions, and that rang true for me because I feel like anytime I talk to someone about this work, it's one of the questions that comes up is, do you see it as a single piece or do you see it as 2 different pieces?
Mm-hmm.
And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the work manifests that, or your experience of whether it's two separate pieces, although it is one, or one, and how you view that. Or
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it's 2 that come to form one, and I think that I think that matters for a lot of reasons: the physical, the metaphorical, the contextual, and they come together elegantly, but I don't think they come together easily. And I think that is a very applicable way of talking about Monika and her work in general. It's very elegant, it makes sense, but it's not easy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about how you and most people see it, you're talking to.
well, when I first encountered it, I absolutely saw it as 2 pieces, and I feel like that piece and this piece have different aesthetics to a degree. But talking with friends and other people, they pointed out kind of the continuousness of certain lines throughout the entire piece. And the title tower is singular, so there is that unity to it, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And who does produce this work? The gallery or the artist herself?
Well, it was made in Poland, sort of with her typical sort of team of fabricators, and that's how she really likes to work. I mean, we talked when we did the Public Art Fund project about, would she work with fabricators here and sort of, try to develop a process, and really in the end, it's so controlled and it's so specific that she really has to do it kind of with her team at home. And in many ways it would be much easier if she could just sort of like, oh yeah, do that in New York or wherever. Christopher is smiling. But then we wouldn't have the fun of like shipping these things all around the world and, installing them.
To be fair, the works that were made for Aspen were produced in Mexico. And she was comfortable with the fabricators that she had worked with in Mexico before. And she...
On many projects.
Yes.
Right.
And the way that it worked there was they were part of the process, and they were able to do a certain amount of work before she arrived, but then she was there for an extended period of time. So they were really only able to do kind of the way it starts, like straight.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't able to do any kind of bends or contortions or twists or anything like that until she arrived.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for allowing us to